Hello, and welcome back after such a long hiatus to our nonfiction book club. It's been ages, and I'm really excited to see Nicole and to see all of you guys
so
here
excited
too.
to see your
I
face.
know. Yeah. I feel like we went through a long period of not seeing each other at all, and now between this and like work meetings, it's like I finally get to see Nicole again.
Yes. Well, also in
So
the beginning of the summer, we were shooting organic chemistry, and like in the hiatus from this book club, we also haven't had chemistry shoots either.
yep,
So I just like
yep.
have not. But now we're back.
We're back. Yeah. Yeah. So welcome again, like I said, to Nonfiction Book Club, our usually monthly meeting to discuss nonfiction books. Things have been kind of chaotic this summer, so we took a month off, came back, took another month off. Now we're back and talking about books again. This month we're here. Next month we'll be back on Nicole's channel, and we'll announce the book we're going to talk about then at the end. But today we're here to talk about The Disordered Cosmos, a journey into dark matter, space-time, and dreams deferred by Chanda Prescod-Weinstein. Oh, wait, should we quickly introduce ourselves?
That's the thing.
I'm Deboki. Yeah, because I think we might have some new people. I've noticed more people signing up for the newsletter, which is exciting. So I'm Deboki. I'm a science writer / I host Crash Course Organic Chemistry. And also talk about books and stuff here on the YouTube. That's me.
I'm Nicole. I used to talk about lots of media all over the internet. I don't know that I do that. I mean, in theory, I still do that. And I also make educational YouTube videos, sometimes with Deboki.
Yes, exactly. But yes, like I said, we're here to talk about The Disordered Cosmos. And so this is written by Chanda Prescod-Weinstein, who is a theoretical physicist. And the book is like really rooted in her personal like experience and curiosity with theoretical physics, like what got her into it, but also like what her experience in the field has been like and kind of like where it's taken her, especially as a Black woman working in the field. And she says this a few times, like as a Black agender woman working in the field, and how these different parts of her like personal and intellectual experience kind of feed into each other, and how that like sort of shapes her like worldview overall. So the book covers a lot. It's like kind of like part memoir, part science book, part essay collection, I think, which is an interesting mix, and it covers a lot of ground, I think. So I'm excited to talk about it. And for those of you who are new, feel free to go into the chat to like, if you guys are inspired to like mention anything that was exciting about the book for you guys, feel free, because that's what the book club is for.
There's a lot to talk about, and yes, and I feel like that we're gonna go in so many bizarre and random directions. It's been so long since we've done this. So if there's something that you are like, wow, this thing in the book, we better talk about that. Tell us, and we'll do that.
Yeah. One of the things, I guess, just starting off, that I enjoyed about the book in terms of its structure or in terms of thinking about it, it's divided into like 4 phases. And so it starts off very, very physicsy. Like the first chapter is like basically, what's it called? Just physics. And like so it has this like feeling of like it starts out with just the physics, and then in each phase, like just kind of like states of matter, like you are, or phases of matter, like you are expanding outward. So then it goes into like physics and the chosen few, the trouble with physicists, and then all our galactic relations, and just kind of keeps branching out from there.
It's so good.
Yeah. Yeah. And I just like, as a structure, found that so interesting, because of like, I mean, like it feels so obvious to be like the structure is cool, but I feel like it also just builds really well with something I was thinking about with this book in general, which is a lot of what it's doing in terms of understanding how we use the language of physics to describe things in general. And so part of that is something it's doing inherently with the structure, and then it's also doing that with a lot of the specific chapters in the book, like when it's talking about dark matter and stuff like that.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, in just in terms of like the overall sort of, I don't know, point, I guess, that she's making, it feels sort of like weird and reductive to even frame it in that, to frame this as like the project of the book, but whatever, to the degree that you can, it it is really like, because all of that is sort of like the point of what she's doing, and sort of like the ways in which we like think about science and understand like what is and isn't science and who gets to do science and whatever. But like the way that the structure is also like literally like the table of contents does that, right? Like I which is not to say that you shouldn't read the whole book, or that the table of contents is a suitable substitute. However, just like walking through like the phases and sort of the like the chapters within each phase, like build that out so beautifully. It's like so thoughtfully constructed and so good.
And I think the fact that she's I think the fact that she starts it in terms of just like focusing on like a specific, like she has this sort of the dark matter isn't dark chapter, and that gets into kind of like some introduction to like this idea of like why this analogy doesn't work, and then she revisits it later, I think in phase 2 with Black people or luminous matter. That itself feels sort of like the particle building to me too, where it's like it starts off with this basic building block of language, and it gets like kind of built out over the course of the book, where the language then becomes about a bigger picture, which then becomes about an even bigger picture, which then becomes about like, you know, downstream, like even more of a big picture. So it's like the language is like a particle. It's just like all building up. Sorry, I'm like, it is reductive, but I'm just like very fascinated by it.
Yes. Well, yeah, because it is so intentional, and like, I don't know, it's just, it is, there is so much to appreciate in this book, that I feel like, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of like very big, heavy stuff that is worthy of, that is like obviously, I don't know, what you would like talk about coming out of this, but I think that it is easy to lose sight of the fact that there is thoughtfulness just all the way down in this book, even in this sort of basic like structural consideration. It's really good. It's really good. If you can read this book, I'm also just gonna listen to us talk. Read the book. Also read the book.
Yes. Definitely. So I have been like deeply enmeshed in this project of like reading a bunch of science books this summer, and they were all life sciences book. And so I have just been generally like dealing with a lot of writers and scientists projecting their anxieties about writing nature metaphors in books, because all of those books at some point have become about this question of like, how do we relate to nature? And so that was what was sort of fascinating to me about this book, because there is no tension in that sense, because a lot of those books, the tension is like, we are totally fucking with nature. Like, how do we position ourselves relative to it? Do we, like, if we anthropomorphize something, if we're like talking about the Anthropocene, to what extent are we shortchanging our terrible role in doing these things? And with physics, like, we're not fucking up particle physics. Like, particle physics like is gonna still exist whether or not we're here. So I feel like there's a really interesting sort of like reversal in direction in terms of like being like, well, how are we then using the language we've constructed in this field to understand us? Like, it's still a question of like, what is the metaphor, but it's now like turned into a question of like, are we using it in a way that's like fair to people, that like or does it dehumanize them? And this comes up in the context of race. It also comes up in the context, she has a chapter where she talks about like queer identities and also like pronouns and stuff. And so it comes up a lot just in terms of like, well, to what extent is this language of this physics field that is supposed to be very expansive and imaginative and creative in its thinking, like to what extent are our own biases and things we've written into the field then like limiting the way that we've decided to use this language? And the we I'm saying is very broad, because it's not all we, like the we does not cover everyone. There is like a divide, but that is
she talks about that too. You know, she talks about that's like at the end of the book too. She talks a lot about this, like we, and also and like the ways in which like we is sort of complicated, and that like there are certain levels on which there's like a broad, all-encompassing we, but then like even within that we, there are varying degrees of who constitutes the we at what time. It's always so exciting when we find books like this that feel just so squarely at the, like in the middle of whatever the original version of this project was meant to be. Like it's
Yeah.
This book, this is it.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also a book that I feel like, to be honest, I feel like so inadequate to discuss too, where I'm like, anything I say, I feel like I'm kind of like disrespecting the book a little bit, because I know like anything, because like a lot of it is rooted in her personal experience, and like rooted in parts of her personal experience that are like, you know, definitely not parts of my personal experience. And so it feels almost a little bit like cheap to be like, oh my God, she's so smart, or oh my God, she's thought about this so well. Because like, I mean, of course she has. She's like coming from like a real lived experience and thinking about it and processing it and like writing about it, has been doing that for like a long time. Like, of course it is. Like, I feel, yeah. But I'm trying, I want to do my best, because I just really, I thought it was a great book. Yeah.
Yes. We're gonna
Which is also, again, why you should read the book. Yeah.
That's usually like our question we end with these nonfiction books, but spoiler, we think you should read this book.
Yes, yes. Yeah, there's something I was going to say about that, and now like have already forgotten that. That's okay. Okay. Okay, so yeah, I guess kind of like moving through. So like we started off with like that's kind of small questions of like, not small questions, but like that kind of like baseline of like the language, and then I guess like the like the rest of the book, once it's sort of like building up these initial questions of like the language, or sort of then thinking about like how do we apply these things. And one of the things I really enjoyed was like kind of moving into the phase 2, where we're like starting to branch out. That chapter on like the physics of melanin was one where I was like, I've got melanin, and I've like never thought, and like even like working in life sciences, like never really thought about it this way. And I thought, so one of the things that like was a part of that chapter, and that becomes kind of a recurring theme through the book, is the way like, how do we like frame diversity in science in a way where, and this is not just about science, but just like treating it in this one specific case, how do we frame it in a way where it's not about exploitation, or about like taking advantage of people, or taking advantage of their labor, or like highlighting exceptional people? Like, how do we actually treat like diversity as something that the science is serving? And that's like something that the Physics of Melanin chapter is framed about. Basically, for those of you who haven't read the book, what this chapter is like, kind of like going into that chapter, what she's talking about is melanin, you know, this pigment molecule that makes us brown, and how research around it has been framed, or the way it's talked about, and how sort of the curiosity in it has been like built more, like at one point where she talks about it, the curiosity has been driven more like towards like, oh, understanding skin cancer in white people, rather than like understanding something more intrinsic to the molecule overall. And then also kind of then trying to figure out like, okay, well, can we have like a curiosity about it without it then turning into something that's exploitative? Like she also highlights this, I think it's the MIT architect who's like kind of doing this like kind of skeezy bit of a project around it, where it like becomes very uncomfortable. Yeah, and I think that's like a tension that's like throughout the book, and it's one that's never really resolved, but it's something that I like I found like very intriguing throughout the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also true of like so much of what this book is saying, is that like there are a lot of like non-resolvable tensions, like that you know, that she's sort of bringing up as like these are all of the things that like I have to think about all of the time, like as just part of, you know, being a physicist, and being, you know, also being just like who I am as a person, and sort of it also just sort of feels like it's a case for like, but also everybody should be, you know, like that.
Yeah.
It shouldn't just be me who's thinking about all of these things all the time, and like some of these things, like they are not like, they are tensions that are not resolvable under like systems and regimes as they are. Like you either have to like really massively overhaul systems, or at the very least, you know, be consistently aware of them enough to be like dismantling them bit by bit. But like there is no easy and clean resolution at any point to any of the things that she is raising throughout this book.
Yeah, because even there's like she's discussing like the work like in Mauna Kea and like protesting telescopes, and as part of that she's highlighting like, you know, indigenous systems of knowledge. But then later on she's specifically saying like, I'm not bringing this up because I want all of us to be like, oh, we should participate in this indigenous system of knowledge, because that's not necessarily like the respectful way to be engaging with it. But it's like, it's a way, like you still have to like know, like there's a knowledge of it, there's an acknowledgement of it too, like there's something that about knowing of it and respecting it that is important, and you don't have to always participate in it to respect something. And I think that there's like part of this book that feels like, usually when I think of a nonfiction book as self-conscious, I think of that as like a very negative thing. It's like, to me, I feel like the author is like trying too hard to kind of like pull back a little bit, or they're like unsure of where things are landing, or they're like trying a little bit too hard to make like a certain image or a certain character kind of like be built a specific way. But this is a book to me that, I mean, like, I guess the better way of saying it is a self-aware, but I think there is a self-consciousness, but in a way that like is very like well explored in terms of like trying to understand, like even with the project of the book itself, of like why she's writing it and what she's trying to get to, of like being very aware that there is a reader on the other side and like how it's going to be received, and trying to be like, to the extent that she can, like very thoughtful of how different readers are going to receive it and kind of engage with that.
Yeah, I mean, well, and that is actually also something she talks about like very explicitly in terms of like talking about sort of psychon and like the way that different sort of publications imagine audiences and like and how and like who they view themselves as talking to, and like the way in which that like perpetuates a lot of this. And so so like it's also very much then like the project of the book to be like perpetually aware of like the reader on the other side of that, and to like not think in terms of generalizations about who that reader is necessarily.
Yeah, and I like it because I feel like it's challenging then for me as the reader too. It's like, oh, I thought I had gotten a little bit smarter, but wait, actually, like I still I didn't just get that knowledge and learn something. It's like there's like more to process.
There is so much about this book that I feel that way about, that I feel like I feel like it was super interesting and I got a lot out of it. But more than that, I feel like I will continue to get a lot out of it. Like not in a like rereading it, although like I definitely actually can see myself rereading this book, but like just in like having read it and letting it like sit in my brain. Stuff at the end about like considering taking a more holistic view of who is doing science, like who is included in the project of science, and like the way that like the janitorial staff in the building is like this is like part of that. Like there's a level like intellectually I hear and agree with what she is saying, but I also like that also just feels like such a big idea that I feel like I need to sit with that longer in order to like truly understand like what that means. Like I don't know, like I feel like I am only like I feel like I only half understand it, I guess. It's sort of like sitting with it and thinking about it.
Yeah, I was thinking about that chapter. So this is specifically a chapter called Wages for Scientific Housework, which I think it's like a very good chapter. And also like you, like I think there's a lot of it that I am still very much processing. And one of the things that like this chapter made me think a lot about was my experience working in lab, where and just like think about other people I know who worked in lab. A lot of us have had that experience, especially if we're women, especially if we're women of color, like of being sort of the one who kind of takes care of things, organizes things, like helps to kind of maintain like whatever culture or maintain a lot of things without, you know, we're not getting paid anymore. It comes at the expense of our work. It comes at the expense of a lot of things. And one of the things that this chapter made me think a lot about is how like when I was working in that situation, and also in other workplaces, it's really not just about that. It's like my focus in terms of when I think about labor and thinking about exploitation in academia has like been, as a grad student, my focus has very much been on like, I think grad students are not treated like workers, and I think they should be. And I think like I think there are a lot of situations that I know of people who have been exploited. I know of people who are still being exploited in like pretty egregious ways. And I think those are all completely like real things, but also that I was so focused, my focus on like labor in academia was so narrow. It was so built on this grad school experience that like I never really thought beyond sort of that scope, because that was like where my energy was. And especially now as someone who does not like have a workplace, I am a freelancer, I work with people, but I don't sit in like any meetings that are geared towards like a workplace, you know, like it's just not like how I am working now. It's like I've effectively have always worked in these positions where I have like not ever been like in an official kind of manager position. And so now like I went from being someone who's not a manager to just kind of working completely on my own. And like so much of my 20s of working in those kinds of positions. Sorry, this is like very messy and rambling, but like just because I've like this chapter's for me like hits on a lot of things that I've been thinking about and don't really have a good coherent thought process for. But just like a lot of that self-centeredness is like was experienced because like I was young and was not thinking beyond myself and had been kind of like raised in this certain like context of academia just like from my own childhood and like wasn't really thinking beyond that. And now like that I don't have a workplace and like I've been thinking about like how would I do things differently. I'm kind of like I don't know, but yeah, so it's like sort of a directionless thing. But that's sort of like where that chapter took me, just because I think for me it's hitting on a lot of my general sense of like having gone from working with people to now working with people, but in a much looser sense and not in that like it basically working in a system that has less of a sense of a hierarchy for me and how I work in it, whereas academia very much has a hierarchy. And I thought of myself as being at the bottom of that hierarchy, and then stepping back and realized like I still had it pretty good. Like there, at least especially for me, like again, I know people who have been exploited like as a grad student in very serious, terrible ways. So like it's not that I think that grad students do not get exploited, just that the nature of what my experience was and how I related to it, I see differently now.
Yes.
yeah. Sorry, I don't. Yeah, there's like and this is like where I feel so like inadequate with discussing the book, because I feel like I'm still in such a messy place with a lot of these things. But again, I think one of the things that I appreciate with the book is that it's not saying like this is the way to do this. It's saying this is what the thought process is. This is what the tension is. This is an ongoing thing. And like it's the same thing as science. Like sometimes we get like science communicators will talk about how frustrating it is that science is described as just like a series of results, when really science is a process. It's something that's really like ongoing. And I think that is, you know, like part of the work of everything else as well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, yeah, like you're apologizing for that being like messy, but it feels that feels extremely tied up in a lot of like the kinds of stories that she is telling in this book too. Like I don't know, but that story felt extremely relevant to me. So.
Yeah, I think and kind of maybe getting to some of the same stuff. I don't know if this is not something that was a chapter in the book, but it's something that I've been thinking about, and that like I feel like this book feels in conversation with. And I cannot remember if we've talked about it in Nonfiction Book Club, but if we haven't, I feel like it's relevant, which is I feel like over the past year and a half, I have been having this like ongoing crisis is a little bit strong of a word, but like debate over like what the point of expertise is, or like what is the point of like venerating expertise, especially in the context of discussions around COVID, where like, you know, so much of our conversations become we need to follow what the experts say, and the experts depend on what the context of your question is, like who you consider an expert is going to depend on like a lot of different things. And so there have been times where the experts disagree, not because there isn't potentially a consensus, but because they're coming at it with different perspectives. And so like scientifically, we understand the notion of experts disagreeing, but like in like something that we're trying to convey to the public, that is something that it becomes a little bit more difficult, because you can't just be like, follow the experts when the experts are saying different things. And then also, I'm like just increasingly uncomfortable with like this idea of like how we label experts in general. Like I think, you know, I obviously like I did the PhD. I will sometimes use doctor, like whatever, like, but like what I'm an expert of is something like very, very narrow. And I think like the extent to which me doing a PhD tells you anything about my expertise, it's like actually not very descriptive. And there's a lot of like I'm pretty stupid overall, like, or like there's a lot of stuff I'm pretty dumb about. Like I like we don't have to get into it, but like it's not hard to find the things that I'm pretty dumb about. And I feel like that is sort of like a part of kind of what that chapter made me think of as well, because it's like we ascribe so much value to being an expert at these certain sort of like intellectual things, and I think they are very important. Like, and I think there's value to it in, especially when we're talking about misinformation, but also that's part of what makes it difficult, because it's so easy in these days to like frame yourself as an expert, that's part of like what's made misinformation possible, is because like we really don't actually know who is an expert in anything. Like we use these labels, and so it's been very easy for people to like say like I'm an expert because I have like XYZ degree, and like that means that like you should listen to me or like whatever. And yeah, when really like expertise is born out of like the actual lived thing that you did. And so for me that was research, but also for a lot of people it's like what they do every day in some other context. It might be a hobby, it might be their job, it might be something else. Like it's like that's where expertise actually is. And like I just wish we had a way to, I don't know, now I feel like the Mean Girls girl. Like I wish we could package all these things in like rainbows and just distribute them, but I just wish we had a better way to talk about expertise without having it be built on like hierarchies of knowledge, I guess, or intellectualism.
This is like a whole other tangent, but there's a book that I read. Actually, I never finished this book. We read like 2 chapters of it for school, and I tried to read it on my own, and it was like too dense. I was like, I can't do this without being in a classroom. I need somebody smarter than me to walk me through all of what this is doing. But first 2 chapters were about like I don't know, modernity and like postmodern society, and how in order to like exist in society today, you have to accept that you actually know very little about how the world that you are operating in works. Like in a way that you move backwards far enough in time, you hit a point where you're like the knowledge that you possess about the fraction of the world that you are interfacing it with is much higher. Whereas like my phone, like I can pick up 20 different objects that have so much going on that I do not know shit about. Like I know nothing about how these things work, how they came to be, and that like the work that everybody is doing is so specialized, and like the way that this I think about this book all the time, because we read this as I was in grad school in, what is this, like 2012, and the world that we've lived through in the years since has given me lots of reasons to reflect on this book and its ideas about like what it does to people to like have to exist in a world where like you just accept that you don't understand things and you have to defer to the knowledge of like expertise. But then like what is expertise, and like who gets to have it, and like how do you understand, like if there are so many things that you do not understand, like how do you know how to decide who you're listening to, it whatever, I don't know. Again, it's like a whole other tangent, but I also have a lot of feelings about this.
And I think this is like a great point too, like that like academia is like inaccessible for a lot of people for like a lot of reasons. And so that like what like that's just like labeling that kind of expertise is like this way that then like only narrows down like who gets to have the sort of like long-term impact on like in the context of this book, like she's talking about in the context of like who has shaped theoretical physics, like who has shaped the language of it, who shaped the research directions, who's deciding things like where telescopes can be built, right? Like these things are all like shaped by like downstream. There are all these many other effects that are, that are really difficult.
And they are wrapped up in this question of like how we are defining expertise and like who gets to be an expert and like what exactly that means.
It was funny that you're saying this about the modernity thing, because there's also this point early on, like, and this is actually different, but it made me think about this quote early on where she was talking about like this, there's this idea that like accepting physics means accepting a world where you can't know everything, because there's just like quantum physics is inherently about a world where there's so much like probability like baked into everything. Like it's just probabilistic. There's no way to know everything. And I had this in my notes. I wanted to explain this. This is something I have been thinking about because I just watched the first episode of this show on CBS called Evil.
I'm so excited. I'm thinking about the things to a show on CBS, and I was like, I will be asking you about what the show is. This is really the only part of this conversation I care about. I'm so excited.
Because so the show Evil, it's just like one of those like X-Files shows, right, where it's like there's a supernatural thing going, but there has to be a skeptic character who's like, science is everything, right? And so there's this priest character who like turns to her in this first episode. He's like, do you believe that with enough time science can explain the entire universe? And she says yes. And I was just sitting there like, I think no. And I feel like it's the first time I've like thought about that question, and like I don't mean this to be like, I'm so smart, but like, I just was like, yeah, I really don't like even as someone like coming from science, who believes in science, who loves science or whatnot, like the more I have like been, especially now that I've been branching out into learning about other areas of science where it's like beyond just like what I like went to school for, it's like the more clear it is to me that like there's just like always like this infinitely expanding world of knowledge that is happening. So like to even ask like, can science explain everything is like ridiculous to me, because like there's just always going to be more. Like there's too much. Like things are evolving, things are changing, things are expanding. Like there's too much to know. And so like I feel like that doesn't mean that you can't know things at all. Like I think it's important not to be like nihilist about it, but like it is also important to be like humble about it, and also be like aware of the fact that like the way that we know things inherently poses like some kind of limit. So like in the context of this book, like she talks about this and like how like, you know, dominant groups get written into our scientific understanding, but she's also writing about it in terms of like how there are other ways of knowing things. And I feel like that like adds to that element of like there's infinite things to know, and there's probably infinite ways to know them.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That like in order to like accept that premise, in order to believe that is true, like that is very much predicated on an idea that like we have figured out the way of knowing things, which already.
Yeah.
And again, like the person, whatever. Never mind. I'm gonna stop this right now.
Oh, man, this book is so good.
I really love this book a lot. This is like
one of the few times I've read the book like several weeks ahead of like when we actually were meeting. And so today I was like going through and just like looking through everything that I had underlined. I also, so like another thing I love is just like how much like pop culture. So part of it, so she does a lot of like weaving in. So in addition to like the theoretical physics, like she's clearly like done a lot of like research into understanding like a lot of like more social science kind of, or like history areas, and like integrating a lot of that. And then also she integrates a lot of pop culture into her discussion, and then like books, like there's like a Mansfield Park discussion in here. Yeah. This is so
Jane Austen.
Like I love a science book that's like not afraid to like be about like other areas of interest that are just like happy to like, especially for again like for a book like this that's like engaging with like so much her own personal like introduction to science. It's like or not introduction, like approach to science, like an experience in it. I feel like that is like a part of it, is like your the way that like pop culture shapes your questions, the way it shapes like your kind of understanding, and all of these things. Like yeah.
Yes, yeah. So the comprehensiveness of the references in this book was really quite a thing to behold. Like the number of like names she references again that are I'm flipping. Sorry, my internet connection is very bad.
No worries.
But anyway, the frequency with which she's like bringing up like names and books and things like that. Oh yes, I'm aware of all prominent sociologists that you're also talking about in your book about physics and universe, whatever. And then talking on like a really broad spectrum. It's also interesting again because she thinks.
Sorry, Nicole. I think you might be cutting out almost to the point of. Sorry, it got very like difficult to understand you for a few minutes there, or for a few seconds there. Okay.
Oh no. Okay. Am I back? Can you?
You're back.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
I can hear the background noise. Yeah. Internet.
About different kinds of knowledge and knowing things, right? And like we've mostly been talking about this in sort of the cultural context, which are in sort of like I don't know, like different cultures, right? And like that I think is the most important way that she means that in this book. But I think that she is enhancing that point by also drawing on, as you said, right, like pop culture references and just like other academic disciplines. And like so it is a really powerful and interesting way of like building out that argument that there are so many different ways of knowing, and that like limiting our understanding of acceptable ways of knowing means that we're like limiting what we can know. I love it.
I'm curious for the people watching, like what if you've read the book, if there were certain sections that you guys like found like that like stood out to you, because I think this is one of those books that like I think everyone will probably have like a section or two that like are really like really made you think about something, like whether that's something from like your own experience or also something that like maybe isn't and like you hadn't really thought about. Because I think for me, like the sections that were like really stood out were like the wages for scientific housework, the physics of melanin, and then I also think the other big one, which I don't know if we want to go into, because it's like a pretty I don't know, it's a darker one, is the rape as part of this scientific story. Because the way she wrote that was also like, I mean, it's like a very like tough chapter overall, but then also the way that she wrote that I think was done with so much, like again, like kind of going to that idea on like self-consciousness. It's done very much with like an awareness of like the fact that she's like having to write this chapter at all, but like and like not being able to like kind of avoid that.
I think yes, the wages for scientific housework we've already talked about at length, but yes, that one was one that like definitely stood out to me a lot. The rape as part of the scientific story chapter is one that will just live here for a really long time. And I think that one. I also think I want to give a special shout out to the very end, the letter to her mom. Just sobbed. So.
We've got to vote for the melanin chapter. Which I agree, because I feel like that one just like it managed to cover so many different aspects of curiosity that I was still like kind of like yeah, like why have I not wondered about melanin? Like why have I not, like, and especially it's like related, like it was like I was coming in like from a bio background, why was I not curious about this? But then getting so complicated about it because nothing's ever freaking simple in this world.
I also really appreciated that chapter too, just from a I don't know, from like the layman perspective of like, that was the chapter where I felt like the sciencey parts were the most comprehensible, where I was like, I understand all of what you're explaining to me.
Yeah.
Some of the physics stuff, I'm like, sure, that
this is our second time venturing into like astrophysics-y territory.
And this time I think she mentioned the first book.
End of everything. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so I think by the time we get to like our fifth one, we're gonna understand a little bit of physics. So we have all of her reflections on the way she always thought there were no scientists in her family history, but then contending with the way that like history erased the achievement of non-white, non-men. Oh my god, this made me think of another chapter. Something I was just thinking about. It was from the section on, I think it was like, who is a scientist? Yes, like as part of that Mansfield Park analysis. Like we were just talking about the Mansfield Park, and she's talking about the Carolyn Herschel. And like whether, like basically, so who is a scientist is like basically contending with questions of who gets labeled a scientist. Scientist as a term was like actually is like a fairly recent like invention overall in the context of like how far back we like study the history of science. Scientist is like not really a word that was necessarily used super widely until more recently, but then it becomes this issue of like, well, who do we call a scientist? And like, you know, there are these men who we call scientists who in their day and age would not have been called this thing, but then also we sometimes get persnickety about like giving the label to like women, and then also to plenty of like non-white people who made important contributions to science. And so she talked about this in the context of Carolyn Herschel, who like made like a number of like really important astronomy discoveries, but like wasn't really getting her due. And she's talking about like, again, like one of those tensions of like really wanting to make sure that Carolyn Herschel would get her due, but then also like recognizing that like Carolyn Herschel was a white woman, and there's like this like tension of like fighting for the recognition of a white woman who would probably not fight for her as a black woman. Like that dichotomy, which is pervasive today, to this day, in terms of like, I mean, that's part of why she's writing it, because it is something that like exists in this day, in terms of like how we talk about diversity in general. I was gonna say women in STEM, but like it's really, really beyond that.
Yes. Yeah. And also, again, one of the many like unresolvable tensions in the book, where it's like, you know, like this is a thing that is there, and
she has like this line: I'm increasingly aware that as much as I have tried to protect Carolyn Herschel's legacy, the likelihood that she would have even thought of me as a human being is possibly low. And it's like, that's like a thing that we talk about in so many different contexts, in terms of like when we talk about books, when we talk about all these different things, like the extent to which like we again, very broadly, like there are times where you find yourself protecting things or like loving things even that like you also know would like not care about you and like not really give a shit, or maybe even like actively like work against you. This is like one of those times. That section actually made me think about like there's this whole debate that always happens. I'd say it like come up in like science journalism context, in the context of like whether or not to use doctor when describing a scientist, or people getting mad that they're not being labeled doctor, like that they're not being given their due. And it's usually like women who are upset about this, because you know, usually if you're like a female expert like giving your opinion, someone will do something to be like, you don't know what you're talking about, right? And so doctor is at least one way to, again, going to that like question of expertise, is like one of those ways to at least hopefully like give people some of that respect. But then like it gets to that weird ickiness of like, I don't know, needing to give the label in the first place. So like, how do you, I have very mixed feelings about those conversations anytime they come up, because it's like the people who usually don't get labeled, who don't get their like proper due, are like, yes, usually women and people of color, but then how do the ways that we give people proper due promote like inequalities overall is a thing that I don't understand how to navigate yet.
Yes, yeah, like they just create sort of like another hierarchy, and it's just a matter of like, now you may come to this side of the hierarchy, but it's like that's not that's not really solving the problem. It's not really addressing like what has created the system where people are not being given proper credit and respect in the first place. That yes.
Lots to sit on. This feels like another like sorry, go for it.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say this feels like a book that I'm gonna like reference again in future discussions.
100%. This is absolutely a book that I will reference in future, and also the first like sciencey book that I'm like, I will probably reread this book. Like this is one that I'm like, I definitely can see myself rereading it. Because again, like because there are so many things that I feel like I have to sit with them longer in order to fully process the full extent of what she is saying. I didn't finish this one like right up to the wire like I usually do, but I did finish it like this morning, and that feels like not long enough ago to have this conversation.
Don't worry, I finished this a few weeks ago, and I'm still like, man, I feel like I should have had more time, but it's still like it's still coming together. I think
I love the quote of her mother's that she keeps revisiting too. I just happened to look down, and it's that people need to know that we live in a universe that is bigger than the bad things that are happening to us, and the way that she sort of keeps tying back to that, and which again is like part of why I just really appreciate for all of the things that this book is doing, the fact that she ends it with a letter to her mother. Like I think I don't know. I appreciate that as a way of wrapping up the project of this book.
I think like if you guys are like looking for like more like this, I definitely would check out. I'm pretty sure she has a blog of some sort. I think she references it in here, and I've checked it out before because she has like some really great resources for readings on like decolonizing science. So I think maybe if you check out her Twitter, I can quickly pull that up so that I'm like not just blindly like being like, you guys should do this. Chanda. Sorry if I But also I think this is like one of those books where the reference section is probably also a great source of further reading.
I flagged there are several books that like I stopped and like added to my notes. Books I would like to read. So yes.
Cool. So this is when we usually do you guys can ask us questions and we will talk about how we felt about the book. This has been another one of those times.
And also stuff that we didn't touch on, because there's in fact so much that we didn't touch on, but if there's something specific that we didn't touch on that you would like to discuss, now's the call.
I feel like we need to come up with a new ending segment, because I think like in the beginning when we were starting, we were like, we need a place to put our like final thoughts, but maybe we've just had like pretty good string of books where like we've spent like a good like 30 minutes being like, we love the book and here's why. This is such a good book, you guys, and here's why.
Did you like this book, Taboki?
Plot twist.
Actually, I hated this book. 0 stars.
No, I thought this was I thought it just really, again, I'm like very into people who are able to tie like personal and scientific narratives together. I just always find that so much more interesting than any kind of like dry, like this is science sort of kind of thing. Like, and especially in the space of a book, you get so much room to do that. And I think she did like a really great job of using that personal to like and scientific like combination to be able to like go in a lot of different directions and really kind of like get into a lot of things. Like Mari Point also really loved the enthusiasm for science. We should mention like there's a lot of love for science. Like we talked a lot about like the kind of like other aspects that she's getting into in this book, but like just straight up like she's like super excited to talk about the science, and it shows. And like she does a really great job of explaining things. Like anything that like I don't get is because like I am still understanding theoretical physics. Like you still like you can tell that like there's so much thought going into how she describes it that I'm kind of like, okay, there's stuff I understand, and I'm going to come back to this, and I'm going to understand it better the next time, and better the next time, and after that,
Well, and to your point too about like integrating the like the human aspects of it, I feel like, and I don't know, maybe this is just like me being super ignorant and like talking out of my ass when I say this, but I feel like with like physics, like theoretical physics, like this feels like an area where that is particularly absent, like the idea of tying science back to human experience. Like it feels, this feels like an area where it is often particularly divorced in terms of the way that people talk about it. And so the fact that she like went to such lengths to make sure to keep it integrated the whole way through, I also thought was really, really impressive, and like made this book all the more, I don't know, like novel, I guess. Like it was doing something new and interesting. So again, maybe people who read a lot of books about physics are going to be like, actually, here's a list of 14 books that are doing this very
No, I mean, my experience of like physics is, it's kind of funny because I feel, so I remember being somewhere where they were talking about how like some people who were making a video about like trying to envision a world through a fly's eyes. They were specifically talking about how they were trying to get biologists to like work with them on this video, but biologists are always kind of like qualifying things, or like not really like, you know, they're always like very cautious about how they're going to explain like what the research says. But physicists will apparently, according to this group, like dive right in. They'll just like fully leap into like the hypotheticals of like, yeah, we think it looks like this, it probably does this, it could do this. Like there's a lot of that willingness, and I think the End of Everything really showed that, where it was like, we're just going to go full in with that thought experiment and just see where it goes. So it's like interesting because there is that like total willingness to dive into like just like how far can you go with something. But like you're saying, like I think it's easy to do that like on like a universe scale and like forget about the person scale probably, because like we are just like little particles in the grand scheme of the universe. Like we are little like blips. And so I think like you're saying, I think like making those metaphors like more rooted in like humans and like examining them too, like because obviously these metaphors have existed, that's why she's examining them to begin with. But I think it was cool how she used that as like both a tool to explore the metaphors and how we're talking about like race, but also to explain like the science. Like I thought that was really it's kind of like an unfortunate like need for it, but I thought it was like an interesting way to use that to teach the science.
Also, and to your point too about like physicists being the ones who are like, yeah, I don't know, like it could be this or whatever. Like that was one of the things that I thought was really cool too at the end of the book, when start talking about ways of like talking about science and going back to this thing about the amount of enthusiasm that she felt for it. Like that was a thing too, that she was like, this is a thing that we should lean into, is that like we don't know, and that's what we can get like weirder, and we should embrace that and like be excited about that. And yes, I love that.
Love this book. Do you want to announce our next book?
Let's do it. Next time on Nonfiction Book Club, I'm scrolling up in this document so that I know when, on Saturday, October 16th. Oh no. We maybe should have talked. That's maybe not.
Oh, okay. Okay, we'll put date TBD for now. We're gonna
Date TBD. We'll let you know in the newsletter that you should subscribe to. If you're following us on Twitter, we'll tell you there. But mostly the newsletter is where you should figure out the date, which is TBD. But we're talking about this book, Paying the Price, College Costs, Financial Aid, and the Betrayal of the American Dream. This is actually a book that I bought last fall, because my boss was talking about it in terms of like, we have this partnership with ASU and like, I don't know, making educational media. This is the economics of education in this country is a thing that is dear to us. So anyway, now we're going to read it and we're going to talk about it. And, you know, it's back to school time. What better time?
Oh, I just realized that I wrote the wrong Saturday.
Is that?
The 9th is the second Saturday.
That is, then we can, then that's correct. Then, yes.
Okay.
That's the date. Just kidding about needing and still subscribe to the newsletter. But we're going to talk about this book on Saturday, October 9th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time.
Yes. Until somehow, inevitably, something changes. But for now, the date
which
is
October.
also
why you should subscribe to the newsletter.
Yes, because apparently I cannot count my Saturdays.
I mean, who knows how to count? Like, what is time anyway?
Yes.
Everything's fake.
Yep.
Great.
There's a whole thing in here about how space-time isn't linear, so I feel like I have been absolved. Yeah. Cool. So that is our next book.
Looking forward to talking to you all about it.
Yep. See you guys in a month. Bye.
Also read this book if you haven't. Okay.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay, bye.